Hello and welcome to Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode number 27. Now this episode is subtitled The Mystic Episode. This episode is going to be a solo podcast with just myself, Max Freakout, experimenting with a new podcasting format, going to see how this goes. So the last episode of the podcast was a three-way conversation between myself, Cyberdisciple and Jimmy, and it generated a large amount of discussion and analysis and also controversy, and even about the fundamental issue of whether or not it is even appropriate for me to have Jimmy as a guest on the podcast, given his whole disorganized conversational style and also his disorganized and incomplete understanding of the egodeath theory. So with this episode, I wanted to carefully respond to what came up in the time since episode 26 came out. And I also wanted to clarify my own point of view on the various issues, which I think is much needed at this point. So in particular, I need to fully explain why I said several times that we are not mystics and that the egodeath theory is not relevant to mystics, or it doesn't address mystics. Because during the conversation with Jimmy and Cyber, I never really said what I personally think, because I was purely split between either paraphrasing the egodeath theory or else paraphrasing Jimmy, kind of saying stuff back to him, what I understood him to be saying or implying. But maybe the recording didn't go exactly according to plan. I didn't keep it focused enough. I failed in that endeavor, because before we did the recording, I had planned to try to make the conversation focus very specifically on the topic of determinism, so that we could clear up some specific misconceptions about the egodeath theory in Jimmy's understanding. But so I didn't exactly succeed in that aim, because Jimmy does have an exceptional ability to throw curveballs into the conversation. So we ended up talking about some topics that I hadn't planned at all, and indeed I hadn't even really ever thought much about a lot of the issues that we talked about during that episode. So it mostly centers around the meaning of the word mystic and the connotations of that word. It was maybe the point when the podcast was thrown off track in terms of what I had planned for it, was the moment when the word mystics reared large in the conversation. So I want to state absolutely precisely what I think about the word mystic and about the definition of the word mystic as well. So first of all, the basic point of grammar is that the word mystic has two forms. It can either be an adjective or a noun. And the egodeath theory already contains a very clear, robust definition of the word mystic in the adjective form, as in the phrase mystic altered state, which appears all over the egodeath theory. So when you're just considering the adjective form of the word mystic, it very straightforwardly just means the same as loose cognitive. But I think something about in the specific etymology of the words is to do with the two-stage dynamic of first secret and then revealed. However, the egodeath theory does not have a corresponding definition of the word mystic in the noun form. Unless I've missed it, I think this kind of recent discussion, this is the first time that this has come up as a big issue. in addition to Jimmy saying explicitly, like, I think that the ego-death theory should cover mystics to a greater extent. So the real problematic issue here is about the meaning of the noun form of the word mystic, plural mystics, which is shorthand for a mystic person. So it's like you've got these two definitions, these two grammatical forms, where the adjective form refers to a state of consciousness, and at least partially it describes that state of consciousness. So it picks out a certain crucial feature of the altered state of consciousness, this hidden and then revealed aspect. But the noun form of the word mystic refers to a person, either to a type of person or else to a specific person. And it doesn't really describe that person, it merely designates them. It's a sign as opposed to a symbol. So my basic position about the noun form of the word mystic is that I am skeptical that it's useful or helpful or meaningful as a concept. And furthermore, I suspect that it might simply amount to a kind of modern era mistake or a misreading of religious mysticism and what that's all about. So in other words, I'm saying the word mystic makes perfect sense. It's easy to define when it's an adjective describing the altered state of consciousness, but it makes far less sense. It becomes ambiguous and perhaps even misleads and distorts understanding when it's used as a noun, as in designating a person, a mystic person. And I think, if I remember correctly, some writer, it might have been Elaine Pagels, made a very similar point about the word Gnostic in one of her books. Might have been the Gnostic Gospels. She said something like, it's not an accurate concept, Gnostic, that is. It's not a natural kind, or it's not an accurate sociological kind. It's more like a modern misunderstanding projected onto a past era. So the people themselves, the people who modern people refer to as Gnostics, wouldn't have seen themselves that way. So it's an anachronistic understanding of what a Gnostic is. And also, exactly in line with the ego-death theory, you can make this kind of point about Jesus. Does Jesus refer to a person, or does Jesus refer to the altered state? Or does Jesus refer to something else, like astrological symbolism or some other theory? So the attitude of the ego-death theory is something like Jesus as a historical person is essentially a modern era mistake, the mistaken assumption of historicism. And the ego-death theory then clarifies that Jesus is properly or esoterically interpreted as an altered state, or at least a metaphorical arrow pointing to the altered state. So the claim I'm making here is I suspect that something similar to this is the case when we consider the noun form of the word mystic. It's like perhaps it's a distorted, exoteric inaccuracy to interpret the word mystic as referring to a person. And also, just with the definition itself, the category of mystic, the way I see it, could be as arbitrarily broad or narrow as you choose to define it. So it could mean any person who has ever taken acid and tripped becomes a mystic. Or you could narrow the definition. It could only be people who have been through the classic initiation progression culminating in ego death. Maybe those are the mystics. Or it could mean only people who know about the ego death theory. So it's a question of how high do you set the bar for attaining mystichood? And it's arbitrary. And the dictionary definitions are completely inadequate for clarifying this matter. They don't tell you, they don't even incorporate and integrate the information from the egodeath theory to be able to think of mystichood in this way. And also, like, Jimmy was playing this exact same definitional game. That's a large part of what he was saying, was attempting to set a bar for being a mystic, for attaining mystichood. And I think one issue that came up if you combine Transcendent Knowledge Podcast episode 26 with all of the discussion that came after it, was one clear indicator of how fuzzily defined the noun form of the word mystic. It's because there were so many different qualifiers that got added on to that word without really even commenting on the qualifiers all that much. So, for example, during that conversation, we hear about great mystics and professional mystics, shamanistic mystics, dictionary-defined mystics, aspiring mystics, and so on. So all these different qualifiers which are going to subtly change the meaning of what we're talking about. And also looking at the various dictionary definitions, they're mostly quite vague and imprecise, in the sense that you can clearly make, all of them basically can be made more precise by integrating the information from the egodeath theory, which none of them have done. So for example, there was one definition that I saw in the Merriam-Webster dictionary, which defined mystic as a follower of a mystical way of life or an advocate of a theory of mysticism. And it strikes me both of those are quite vague, and both of them stand to be corrected by the egodeath theory. To say a follower of a mystical way of life needs to be clarified precisely in terms of what changes in a person's daily conduct before and after psychedelic initiation. And to say the second definition there, an advocate of a theory of mysticism, well, that's, you can straightforwardly just say an advocate of the egodeath theory, perhaps. I mean, are there other theories of mysticism that, would also compete for that title of turning a person into a mystic? But anyway, having said that, I would also say that any definition of what a mystic person is would surely have to include people like me and Jimmy and Michael Hoffman and Cyberdisciple, us like altered state explorers and thinkers, to have any real meaning. If we are not mystics in this world, then nobody is. I mean, like, that's crazy to think of what you would have to do if we didn't fit the bill. So Jimmy said twice that he thinks he's an aspiring mystic, and I take that to mean like not really a mystic, especially in the way that he couched it, of like, I should trip more often to be like the mystics were. He wasn't including himself in the group known as mystics by calling himself an aspiring mystic. But, I would be more inclined to say, no, he's not aspiring. He's a highly advanced mystic because, well, two reasons. First of all, because of his personal experience. He's had really hardcore bad trip on mushrooms, which is such a central part of understanding mysticism, understanding religious metaphor, but also because of the fact that he's engaging in this dialogue. He's coming on the Transcendent Knowledge podcast, and even though he might not be fully able and as competent with understanding the theory as some other people that have been on the podcast, at least he's engaging in a dialogue. At least he's not just ignoring it or turning the other way, like not wanting to engage with it at all. So he's actually, he's an advanced mystic. He just doesn't think of himself that way. But so to be absolutely clear, that's my opinion. That's what I think personally, which I explicitly avoided saying during episode 26 of the podcast, because it's too complicated and nuanced. and it was completely not relevant to what I was trying to achieve with Jimmy, which is to have a conversation about the intricacies of the concept of determinism, and we'd gone off course by that point. So yeah, that's how I understand mystichood, like a fairly, unhelpful concept. I think I have a tepid opinion about the word mystic in the noun form of the word. So I need to explain very carefully why I said and why I repeated several times the claim that we are not mystics. So it's crucial to understand the context of that claim in light of the conversational dynamics that I was immersed in at the time, rather than just isolating that claim, we are not mystics. To do that is to take it out of context. It was a highly unusual, highly specific context that I was saying that in. Because as I said, I planned that conversation to be very specifically just about the concept of determinism, just to clear up a crucial place where Jimmy seemed to be getting the ego-death theory wrong. But at the same time, I knew from experience, I know from a lot of dialogues that I've had with Jimmy, that it is difficult, typically, to pin him down, to keep a conversation focused on a specific topic, and to get him to come to a specific, concrete conclusion about any particular topic. It's a challenge, and it's something that I've tried to do a lot in the past, and been met with a lot of frustration when I've been doing it. So I was very much in the mental mode of, I must just keep this conversation on track, keep bringing it back to the core focus. This time I'm going to succeed with Jimmy. Like, I have to achieve what I failed to do last time. So I was really psyched up to lock horns with Jimmy and try to keep his mind focused and just have a productive conversation that actually goes somewhere, goes towards further clarification and no longer repeating errors, misunderstandings. But then, so the conversation was progressing, and then at some point it occurred to me that Jimmy was talking about a concept that he had constructed in his own head, and he was uniquely defining this thing, which he was calling mystics. Sometimes he said shamans. I think once or twice he used the word shamans to mean more or less the same thing. But mostly he was saying mystics. And he was explicitly defining this concept as a group of people. So there's various things that he said about mystics, various characteristics that he picked out in his idea, his idealization of what mystics are. He said things like they were from a bygone era. He said they don't really exist in the modern world. And he said that he didn't say maybe, but he implied that they're holier than we are. They're more special than we are because they have better ethical conduct, for example. Like we were talking about Jainism at one point, where they're known for being highly, morally conscious on a day-to-day level. And also he said not just better ethical conduct, but that they trip more often. He said that they were frequenting the altered state, and that he doesn't see anybody in the modern world, including himself, frequenting the altered state like these ancient mystics were. And he said that these mystics, they lived in like secluded temples in the forests in some places. And also he said mystics can sometimes access the psychedelic state by natural means like Hesychasm. He didn't go into much detail about Hesychasm. I looked it up afterwards. It's like the Christian concept of contemplation, like basically probably something like sitting around meditating, probably. But he didn't really define that. He just said, they go into the psychedelic state by natural means. They don't need to take drugs. Those are all things that Jimmy said more or less explicitly during that conversation in episode 26 about what mystics are. Like, that was his concept of a mystic. So he was setting his own bar for the level of specialness that mystics have. He was suggesting his own definition of what mystics are. And generally, at least, like, I strongly got the impression that he was defining mystics in such a way that it's like he wanted to push them out of reach of us, make them more special or better. Like, he was striving to define mystics as a special class of people, somehow above everybody else, different from everybody else. And yet, crucially, he was including himself in the set of non-mystics. He wasn't claiming to be a mystic. Like, aspiring mystic to me means failing to attain mystichood. And he said that he himself didn't trip often enough. It was like he was lamenting himself for not tripping often enough to be a proper mystic. He felt guilty about it, because he said he does it once a year. So I explained like how I think that the concept of the noun form of mystic in general is poorly defined. I think that's a broad overall opinion that I have. It's not a concept that I would normally use myself. I wouldn't bring a concept like that into a conversation. It was very much strongly prompted by Jimmy to even start talking about mystics in this way. And so then, like, it's like, so I start out by thinking, without really thinking about it very much. I just have this general feeling that the word mystic is poorly defined and not very useful. And then Jimmy is saying all these things about mystics in the forest and mystics who have really good ethical conduct, don't kill insects, that kind of thing. And at that point, I got the feeling that he was basically pushing the concept of mystic even further into the realms of feeble definition than they already are. I mean, I think that probably, inevitably, a big part of this is simply the fact that the nature of verbal communication compared to written communication, it's a completely different thing. Like, in a written conversation, like on a web forum or email exchange, it would be so much easier to explicitly spell out the respective definitions of the word mystic. You know, the truly philosophical approach to breaking down a discussion like this. But given, like, you have to understand, this was a spontaneous, unscripted, verbal conversation. And furthermore, like, it was a conversation with Jimmy, like, of all people, like this very particular type of person with a very particular style of communicating. You know, Michael Hoffman was talking about ADHD, attention deficit, Asperger's, to characterize, you know, this way of communicating. So it's like whenever I'm talking with Jimmy, like, what's going on in my head is, you know, if I'm the one that's doing the talking at the time, like, okay, I've maybe got a few more seconds to make a point, to say something, and then Jimmy is going to start talking again, and he's going to come up with some other tangent, you know, plucked out of some place. He'll say something like, I don't know if you've heard of this person. I don't know if you've heard of this idea. And then I have to listen to him talk about this and figure out how to integrate it into the theme of the conversation. And it's almost inevitably going to be some trite, predictable pop spiritualism, you know, making the same kind of predictable, familiar mistakes when compared alongside the ego-death theory in what they're trying to explain, spiritual issues. Nothing really impressive. He impresses me with the breadth of his book knowledge. Like, it's impressive that he's got a good bibliography attached to him, to his message. But none of the individual writers impressed me that much. Like what's impressive when you've got the ego death theory? Ramesh Balsekar is feeble compared to the ego death theory in terms of, the depth of the explanation. And so the conversation with Jimmy is just not a particularly organized situation. On the contrary, it's chaotic and disorganized. To have that hour and a half period of engaging in verbal dialogue with this guy. It's like I want him to be a part of the conversation, because the alternative approach would be to just say to him, okay, Jimmy, sit down, shut your mouth, and I'm going to lecture you about the ego death theory. Talk to me at the end, ask questions at the end. But that's not the way I'm doing it. That's not the way I do things. I'm hoping that his comprehension will gradually just kind of come about over time via this back and forth communication. So I give him all the space that he needs to spell out what he wants to talk about, but I'm always trying to link it back to the core concept of the ego death theory. I mean, that's one thing about Jimmy that did impress me, is sure, he's kind of all over the place with his citations of different writers, but I like the way that he really gives so much attention to Ramesh Balsekar. He's got an instinct about that, at least, that Ramesh Balsekar probably one of the most explicitly relevant writers in the domain of pop spiritualism for the ego death theory. Given that basically Ramesh Balsekar's whole presentation was a self-help guru, and if you take all the self-help gurus and then measure them up, for the criteria of relevance, applicability to the ego death theory, so he's Jimmy has focused on Ramesh Balsekar because he recognizes, I hope he does, the closeness of the model. Written communication is just so much more organized than verbal communication, because it allows for the possibility of rereading. When you write a comment, you can go over it, and I always do this when I'm engaging in written discussions on by emails or web forums. I will edit and re-edit and keep reading and refining the way that I write something. But it's completely different in verbal communication, because you just, as soon as a comment, a sentence has left your mouth, that's it. You can't go back and change it. So invariably, the quality of the communication is going to be suboptimal compared to written. But anyway, so Jimmy mentioned being an aspiring mystic. He said that 3 times in total over the course of the episode. So one time he said, I am an aspiring mystic. So it's he was in some way, he was characterizing his relationship with mystics. But then a second time he said, hey, remember that I am an aspiring mystic. He was putting that issue back into the conversation. But then on a separate occasion, I don't know if it was before or after, he said, he actually contradicted himself on that point. And he said, if I was an aspiring mystic, I would trip more often than once a year. So that implies that he's not even an aspiring mystic, let alone an actual mystic. So in other words, Jimmy stated 3 times the logical equivalent of, I am not a mystic. But that contrasts with what I said a minute ago, that the way I see Jimmy personally, in my opinion, is if someone put a gun to my head and insisted on pain of death that I have to answer the question, is Jimmy a mystic? I would say, well, yeah, that's a no-brainer. Of course he's a mega advanced mystic, even though he doesn't think he is. From my point of view, he's a mega advanced mystic. He's quite close to the cutting edge. the growing tip of mysticism, which is the ego-death theory. But of course, in any normal situation, I would never do that because I don't like the concept of mystic in the noun form. I think it's a suboptimal concept. I never use that concept naturally, just, of my own volition, because I don't really agree with the whole edifice, the whole network of associations of using the word mystic to refer to a person instead of a state of consciousness. So I think that definition of mystic, it's like a suspicion. Like, I suspect that it's grounded in modern era distortion concerning what mysticism is really all about. I mean, I think the question that comes up here is, who exactly gets to do the etymology in cases like this? Like, on whose authority do we take the etymology? Do we leave the etymology up to the kind of people that write the dictionaries, who don't incorporate the ego-death theory, and who knows if they themselves are psychedelic initiates or not? But they don't explicitly incorporate the concepts of psychedelic initiation into their dictionary definitions of the word mystic. Or can we trust ourselves as psychedelic initiates, as advanced initiates who know about the ego-death theory? Can we decide ourselves? So Michael Hoffman has talked about this issue in regard to the etymology of the word baccalaureate and whether it relates to Bacchus and laurel. And he asked the same question, like, who do we leave it up to? Who is the correct authority in etymology for these, very central, relevant concepts? Like the meaning of mystic, the meaning of what a laurel represents, that kind of thing. So I get to this point in the conversation with Jimmy in episode 26, where I suddenly realized that he's doing this. He's talking about mystics in this way. Like, it's like I felt that he had succeeded in throwing the conversation off track, away from determinism and into irrelevance, like concepts about mystics that I don't even agree with, that I've never even thought about. When I still hadn't achieved my goal of pinning him down on a clear understanding of the way that determinism is relevant to, or the way that it applies to the ego-death theory. And so I said, emphatically, like several times, I said, we are not mystics. And like when I said that, I was basically paraphrasing Jimmy. I wasn't expressing my own opinion. I was repeating back to Jimmy what I understood him to be saying, that we are not mystics. So he was saying that he isn't mystic, and then I guess to establish kinship with him, like put myself in the same bracket, maybe. I don't know what was going through my head exactly at that point, but according to his definition of what a mystic is, as I understood him to be saying, these ancient forest-dwelling people who trip very regularly by natural means, etc. This idealized concept of a mystic, who's basically better than us, above us, more holy than we are. But that's not what I think at all. My opinion on the question of, is Jimmy a mystic or am I a mystic, is far more nuanced than a simple binary yes or no answer. We are mystics, we are not mystics. And I've never thought about it in this much depth and like spelled it out in this much depth, because it had never mattered to me that much. So I think that my strategy in the conversation at that point, saying we are not mystics, I think what I was really saying is like something along the lines of, Jimmy, I don't want to talk about your artificial conception of what mystics are. Please stop talking about mystics. They are irrelevant to this conversation. Let's go back to talking about determinism like I had planned to. Another thing that I said, which I need to carefully address here, saying that the ego-death theory is not relevant to mystics. And I think when I said that specific comment, I was somehow tacitly using the same kind of definition of mystic, which belongs only to Jimmy. You know, this idealized way of like special forest-dwelling people who trip very often, that set of associations that Jimmy was using. It's like the kind of definition of mystic that pushes them away artificially from the scope of the ego-death theory. You know, for example, just to explain this, like, as I see it, lack of relevance between the ego-death theory and Jimmy's conception of a mystic. It's like the ego-death theory contains no account of the psychological effect of tripping very frequently, which is distinct from its account of the psychological effect of the standard initiation sequence, which culminates in mystical ego-death, death and rebirth experience. The ego-death theory doesn't explicitly distinguish that from what Jimmy mentioned about like mystics tripping frequently as like almost a daily thing. Because you know the standard initiation sequence, it's like Michael Hoffman has clearly spelled that out. It just requires a small handful of psychedelic sessions. It's not about some unknown number done very, very frequently as like a major life practice. It's a circumscribed thing, psychedelic initiation. It takes a finite amount of time it has a beginning, a middle, and a completion to it, which didn't sound like what Jimmy was describing at all. So, no, I could clarify then, I suppose, what I exactly meant. I think that mystics are as irrelevant to the ego-death theory as Jimmy's sense of frequenting the psychedelic state of consciousness is irrelevant to the ego-death theory, given that the ego-death theory is about this progression, this psychological progression that happens during a finite number of sessions. And similarly, the ego-death theory contains a completely different model of the meaning of the transformation in morality, the transformation in moral consciousness, which accompanies psychedelic initiation, which actually denies the kind of egoic, free will-based idea of moral transformation that Jimmy was talking about. So he said, he gave the specific example of he found it harder to kill insects since his psychedelic tripping experience. So that's egoic style of modeling morality and modeling the transformation in morality, whereas the ego-death theory has this much deeper issue of this much deeper way of describing it as like there's whether you kill insects or not, according to the ego-death theory, any act of killing an insect or refraining from killing an insect or whatever is eternally contained within the four-dimensional crystalline block universe, the pre-existing future. And so God, the sculptor of the block, is ultimately responsible for all acts, whether they are good or evil, in the conventional egoic sense of morality. But again, in my own personal opinion, which I did not express on the last podcast, I think that the ego-death theory is relevant to mystics, but to mystics who are defined differently. You know, it does. So it may be irrelevant to Jimmy's definition of mystics, but it's relevant to a different definition of mystics. And then to further flesh that out, I would say that the optimal definition of what a mystic is, which would then bring mystics within the explanatory scope of the egodeath theory, is probably going to be some combination of the various dictionary definitions of the word from the various dictionaries, but then additionally upgraded or clarified by the information which the egodeath theory reveals. So you need to look at the dictionary definitions with the egodeath theory in mind, and then come up with a new combination, like a new absolutely airtight version of how to define mystic, which takes the egodeath theory into consideration. But then when you think about that, that's like a blatant tautology. It's circular logic, because what you're saying is the egodeath theory is relevant to the egodeath theory's own inferred definition of what a mystic is, as opposed to Jimmy's irrelevant definition of what a mystic is. But there's so many other words and phrases that we can use to try to define what exactly we are, like our small group who are actually engaged in this this conversation. So it's like, are we mystics? Are we gnostics? Are we shamans? Are we hierophants? Are we wise men? Are we shepherds? Are we God's chosen elect, etc.? And many others. Shorthand words for psychedelic initiate. So, I mean, personally, my favorite word, which I prefer to think in terms of in trying to conceptualize my role, Michael Hoffman's role, where we fit in the world, is the word prophet. I think that's a much more powerful term, much more directly relevant to the egodeath theory than mystic, because it contains this implicit part of the etymology is like seeing the future. It's the reference to the pre-existence of the future is built into the word prophet. And also it contains a connotation of rarity and alienation from non-prophets. So, I mean, in that regard, I'd be fascinated to hear Jimmy comment on whether or not he's an aspiring prophet, or who does he consider to be prophets. Does he think that Ramesh Balsekar, for instance, is a prophet? So another issue that came up with the whole concept of fusing the two states of consciousness. That was Michael's word. Like, Michael was the one who brought that into the discussion. The way I said it in the last podcast, it was something like collapsing the distinction between the two states of consciousness. So the way I see it, the way I understand the egodeath theory, it's like, in some sense, the two states are, as a matter of fact, fused, or they become fused in some sense at the point of egodeath, but in a different sense of being fused, a different sense of what it means to be fused. The two states of consciousness are not fused. So again, it's not a binary, straightforward issue of fused or not fused. Like, there's a semantic challenge here to define the sense in which the two states of consciousness are fused and the sense in which the two states of consciousness are not fused. So it's an ambiguity in the meaning of the word fuse, because fuse can mean blend, or it can also mean like blend as in mix, but it can also mean join or fix, like join together, fix together. So I think that the best way of saying it, the two states of consciousness are joined, but they're not blended. So they're fused in the sense of joined, but they're not fused in the sense of blended. They don't become one, but they do become attached to each other. It's like this is in line with the ego-death theory. Like the two states are joined because they are contiguous with each other. You go from the ordinary state into the altered state and then back again. But the memory of each state is present in the other state. So you can remember the ordinary state when you are tripping, and you can remember what it's like to trip when you're back in the ordinary state. It's like a yin-yang symbol with like that's the shape of the join between the two states of consciousness. So I think the way that Jimmy was defining the way that mystics access the altered state of consciousness suggested to me a blending to some extent of the two states, as opposed to mere joining. Jimmy was veering in the direction of blending. So, for example, he talked about mystics tripping frequently. He didn't. I don't think he spelled out exactly how frequently he had in mind, but that suggested to me like a blending of the altered state of consciousness into ordinary life, to make it part of daily routine instead of a special thing set apart in circumscribed trip sessions. And similarly, he was talking about, like he thinks that mystics use natural means, like Hesychasm, to access the altered state without taking drugs. And that also suggests to me a kind of blending. I mean, so maybe he's not precisely defining it that way, but it's like I get the impression that's what he's pushing towards. That's something like what he has in mind. I mean, so maybe I'm stretching Jimmy to make Jimmy fit into the concept of blending of the two states of consciousness. But I think it's more general than that. It's a general, I'm trying to understand Jimmy's whole mindset. And so I suppose the way I see it, it's like he's got two competing forces in his head. I think that's a good way of understanding what's going on with him. His book knowledge and his experiential knowledge compete. And so he does understand the distinction between the two states of consciousness, but at the same time, he strives to blur that distinction. I think I get the impression that maybe Jimmy is disappointed by enlightenment. He's expecting something more than deterministic non-control. He wants something more blissful, perhaps, than a panic-stricken, psychotic trip to hell. And he's seeing that blissful thing in the pop spirituality books that he's reading. Because those books, like Ken Wilber and Ramesh Balsekar, people like that, they're based at most in the premature beginner stage of the non-dual style of thinking, and then mistaking that for advanced enlightenment and ego death, against his own personal experience of the altered state. So he did actually express explicit disagreement with Michael's characterization of non-dual experience as beginner's level. He wants that non-dual blissful thing. He wants to elevate that to the advanced level enlightenment. So that's why he comes up with this idealistic concept of a mystic for whom the distinction between the two states is different to how the ego-death theory describes it. And then because the ego-death theory is for ordinary people, it doesn't apply to mystics in that regard. So I think I'm going to leave it there for this episode. But I think the next thing that should happen maybe is another trialogue with Jimmy. So we will see how that goes. So until next time.